Chapter 1. Betrayal and Amnesia. Rachel stood in front of the French window of the apartment, looking at the bustling city outside the window. She was wearing a simple white dress, her long hair casually draped over her shoulders, with a gentle smile on her face. She is a young and low-key rich man in the city, with many properties under her name and abundant wealth, but she never shows off. For her, the most important thing is not money, but the man she loves deeply beside her, Mark. Rachel has been dating Mark for 2 years. In these 2 years she has never revealed her wealth to Mark. She didn't want money to be a burden on their relationship, and just wanted to live an ordinary and happy life with him. However, as time went by, she felt more and more that it was time to let Mark know her identity. She didn't want to hide it anymore, she wanted to spend her life with him. That day Rachel decided to give Mark a surprise. She got up early, carefully prepared a breakfast that he loved most, and picked a bouquet of fresh roses. She knew that Mark had been under a lot of work pressure recently, so she wanted to give him a little warmth and support in this way. More importantly, she decided to confess her identity to Mark today. She wanted to marry him and she hoped that they could face the future together, whether they were poor or rich. She believed that Mark would understand her and accept everything about her. Rachel gently pushed open Mark's bedroom door, but found it quiet inside. Mark's suit jacket was casually draped on the chair, and his tie was loosely hanging on the hanger. She frowned, thinking that he might have gone out. Just as she was about to put down her breakfast and go to the company to find him, she heard a low laugh from the living room. She walked slowly to the living room, and through the half-open door she saw a picture that she would never forget in her life. Mark was hugging a sexy woman tightly. The woman's hair fell on Mark's shoulders, and his hand was gently stroking her waist. The two were completely unaware of Rachel's existence and were still whispering love words. At that moment time seemed to freeze. Rachel's mind was blank and she only felt that her heart was being pinched hard, and she was almost unable to breathe due to the pain. She heard a low sob in her throat and Mark and the woman separated in panic and turned around. "Rachel." Mark's face turned pale in an instant and he opened his mouth, but he didn't know what to say. The woman hurriedly tidied her clothes and showed an innocent expression. "Rachel, this is really not what you think." "Not what I think?" Rachel's voice was trembling and she felt anger and pain spreading rapidly in her body. She tried to keep herself calm, but tears had already flowed down uncontrollably. "Do you think I will believe this nonsense?" Mark's face became even uglier. He lowered his head and dared not look into Rachel's eyes again. The woman wanted to explain something, but Rachel couldn't bear it anymore. She turned around and rushed out of the apartment without even having time to put on her coat. The air outside was cold and biting, but Rachel didn't feel it at all. She rushed to the garage, started her car, and then drove on the road like crazy. She didn't know where she was going, she just wanted to escape from this heartbreaking place. The scenery outside the car window was rapidly receding, and Rachel's tears kept flowing, blurring her vision. Her heart was full of anger, pain, and disappointment, and she couldn't even believe that the man she loved would betray her. However, fate didn't seem to let her go. Without her noticing, a large truck suddenly rushed over from the side. Rachel only felt a violent collision and then everything fell into darkness. When she woke up again, she found herself lying on a hospital bed. The severe pain in her head made her almost unable to move. She tried to open her eyes, but found that her memory was in chaos. She remembered who she was, but she couldn't remember what had just happened, nor why she was here. The doctor came over with a trace of sympathy on his face. "Ms. Rachel, you have amnesia. The car accident has caused a serious impact on your brain. Although your body is not seriously injured, your memory has been affected." Rachel's heart was at a loss and she didn't know what to say. She remembered that she was a wealthy woman and that she had a boyfriend whom she loved deeply, but she couldn't remember his name or what happened between them. The doctor continued, "Your memory may gradually recover over time, but before that you need to rest well." Rachel nodded, but her heart was full of uneasiness. She didn't know how she should face this strange world, nor how to face her future. At this moment, a vague figure suddenly emerged in her mind. It was her first love in her youth. He was poor but gentle and had brought her endless warmth and happiness. Although she hadn't thought of him for a long time, he became her only sustenance in this chaotic world. Rachel closed her eyes and held the vague figure tightly. She didn't know if she could still find her memory, but she knew that she needed someone to rely on, and he was her only hope. Chapter 2. Disguised Encounter. Benjamin stood in front of the mirror and looked at himself carefully. He was wearing an ordinary blue work suit, and his hair was deliberately messy. If it weren't for his deep eyes and upright posture, he would look like an ordinary deliverman. He sighed, picked up the car keys and walked out of the room. His family has always hoped that he can marry Jessica, a well-matched socialite, to consolidate the family's power. But Benjamin longs for free love and hates the blind dates arranged by the family. He doesn't want to be bound or lose his freedom. In order to avoid those annoying blind dates, he disguised himself as a deliverman and drove a small truck through the streets and alleys of the city. Although he knew that he was a little willful, he couldn't stand the arranged life. That day the sun was a little dazzling and Benjamin was rushing to deliver the goods, feeling a little irritable. He just turned a corner and saw a woman walking on the side of the road in a trance. She looked a little confused, with a hint of helplessness in her eyes. Benjamin subconsciously stepped on the brakes, but was still a step too late. With a bang, the woman fell to the ground and uttered a low groan. "Oh my God, miss, are you okay?" Benjamin got out of the car quickly, ran to the woman and squatted down to check her injuries. The woman raised her head and looked at him in confusion. There was a trace of panic on her face, but there was a trace of eagerness in her eyes. Benjamin's heart tightened. He had never seen such eyes before, which seemed to hide endless pain and desire. "Are you, Ben?" The woman's voice trembled a little, but her eyes gradually became firm. Benjamin was stunned. He didn't know who this woman was, nor did he know why she recognized him in this situation. He shook his head subconsciously, but seeing the woman's anxious eyes, he nodded inexplicably. "It's me, I'm Ben." His voice was a little low, but his eyes were full of tenderness. A trace of surprise flashed in the woman's eyes and she held his hand tightly. "Ben, you are finally here. I thought I would never see you again." Benjamin's heart was shocked. He didn't know what to say, so he could only hold her hand tightly. He looked at her confused and anxious eyes, and suddenly had an urge to protect her. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The woman shook her head. I don't remember. I only remember you, Ben." Benjamin's heart was in chaos, but he knew that he couldn't leave her. He helped her up and gently patted the dust off her body. "It's okay, I will help you regain your memory." The woman raised her head and looked at him with trust in her eyes. "I believe you, Ben." Benjamin's heart warmed and he knew that he could no longer leave her. He helped her get into the car and took her to the nearest hospital. In the hospital, the doctor examined the woman's injuries and found that she was only slightly injured, but her memory was severely impacted. Benjamin sat beside her and held her hand tightly. "Don't worry, I'll be with you," he said softly. The woman nodded, leaned on his shoulder and closed her eyes. Benjamin's heart was soft. He knew that he had fallen into the vortex of this accident, but he couldn't extricate himself. Benjamin sat in the corridor of the hospital watching Rachel sleeping in the ward. His heart was full of contradictions and confusion. He never thought that he would meet a woman with amnesia in this situation, and she would recognize him as her first love. "Ben," Rachel whispered softly in her sleep, and Benjamin's heart was shocked. He didn't know whether he should tell her the truth, but he couldn't refuse her cruelly. "Who are you?" he whispered to himself with a trace of confusion in his eyes. He thought of his family's expectations of him and his long-standing desire for free love. He didn't want to be bound, but he didn't want to hurt the woman in front of him. Her helplessness and trust made him unable to refuse. "Benjamin, what are you thinking about?" His good friend Alex suddenly appeared beside him, interrupting his thoughts. Benjamin raised his head, looked at Alex, smiled bitterly and shook his head. "I don't know what to say, Alex. I met a woman who lost her memory, but she thought I was her first love." Alex was stunned and then showed a surprised expression. "This is really a tricky situation." "I know." Benjamin sighed. "I didn't want to lie to her, but seeing how much she trusted me, I didn't know how to start." Alex patted his shoulder. "You have to be careful about this, Ben. What about your family? Sooner or later they will find out about your disappearance." Benjamin nodded. He knew Alex was right, but he couldn't give up his sense of responsibility for Rachel. He looked at Rachel in the ward, his heart full of contradictions. "I'll find a way," he whispered with a hint of determination in his eyes. When Rachel woke up, she found herself lying on a hospital bed. Her head still hurt a little and her memory was still a mess. She tried to recall what happened just now, but she only remembered the man named Ben. Ben. She whispered softly with a hint of confusion in her eyes. The nurse came in and saw that she had woken up with a smile on her face. "Miss, you are awake. You hit your head and the doctor said you need to rest well." Rachel nodded, but her heart was full of uneasiness. She remembered that she was looking for someone, a man named Ben. She didn't know why, but she instinctively felt that he was very important. "Where is Ben?" she asked softly. The nurse was stunned for a moment and then said, "Are you talking about that gentleman? He is waiting for you outside." Rachel's heart warmed up and she nodded. "Please tell him that I want to see him." The nurse nodded and turned and walked out. Soon Benjamin came in and saw that Rachel had woken up, and a relieved smile appeared on his face. "How do you feel?" he asked softly, walked to her bed and sat down. Rachel looked at him with a trace of confusion in her eyes. I don't remember. But I remember you, Ben." Benjamin's heart was shocked and he gently held her hand. "Don't worry, I will help you regain your memory." Rachel nodded, leaned on his shoulder and closed her eyes. She didn't know why she trusted him so much, but she instinctively felt that he was her only support. Benjamin took Rachel away from the hospital. He didn't know where to take her, but he couldn't leave her alone outside. He decided to take her back to his small apartment first. At least there could be a temporary haven for her. "Where is this?" Rachel looked at Benjamin's small apartment with a trace of confusion in her eyes. "This is my home." Benjamin said softly, "Open the door and let her in. You stay here first and wait until you recover your memory." Rachel nodded and walked into the apartment. She looked at this simple and warm little nest and her heart was filled with warmth. She didn't know why she felt so familiar here, but she instinctively felt that it was safe here. "Ben, will you stay with me?" she asked softly with a hint of expectation in her eyes. Benjamin nodded. "I will, Rachel. I will stay with you." Rachel's heart warmed, she leaned on his shoulder and closed her eyes. She didn't know when her memory would be restored, but she knew that as long as he was there she would no longer be afraid. Benjamin looked at her with a hint of tenderness in his eyes. He knew that his life had been disrupted by this woman, but he could not give up his sense of responsibility for her. He decided to put aside the pressure of the family for the time being and take care of her first. "I will help you get your memory back," he said softly with a hint of determination in his eyes. However, he didn't know that this unexpected encounter would completely change his life. Chapter 3: Flash Marriage. Rachel held Benjamin's hand tightly, as if she was afraid that he would disappear in the next second. Her eyes were full of confusion and dependence, and Benjamin felt an unprecedented sense of responsibility under her gaze. He never thought that he would be so closely connected with a woman in this situation, especially when she lost her memory. "Ben, you won't leave me, right?" Rachel raised her head, with a hint of uneasiness in her eyes and a slight tremor in her voice. Benjamin's heart was shocked, and he looked at her expectant eyes and felt an irresistible impulse. He gently held her hand, his voice low and gentle. "I won't leave you, Rachel. I will stay with you until you get your memory back." A trace of relief flashed in Rachel's eyes, and she held Benjamin's hand tightly, as if it was the only support she could grasp. Although her memory was vague, she could feel Benjamin's sincerity and warmth, which made her find a trace of peace in the chaotic world. "I want to be with you, Ben," Rachel said softly with a hint of firmness in her voice. I need you." Benjamin's heart was in a mess. He knew that Rachel's dependence was not entirely based on real emotions, but because she had lost her memory and regarded him as her only support. However, looking at her helpless appearance, he couldn't refuse cruelly. "Rachel, He was about to speak but was interrupted by Rachel. "Ben, I want to marry you." Rachel's voice was a little anxious. "I know it sounds sudden, but I really don't want to lose you again." Benjamin was stunned. He never thought that Rachel would propose marriage under such circumstances. His heart was full of contradictions and struggles, but he couldn't ignore the expectation and fear in her eyes. "Rachel, are you sure?" he asked softly, trying to give her a chance to think calmly. Rachel nodded with a hint of determination in her eyes. "I'm sure. I need you, Ben. I want to be with you forever." Benjamin's heart warmed up. He looked at her expectant face and suddenly felt an irresistible impulse. He knew that he had fallen into this unexpected emotional vortex and couldn't extricate himself. "Okay, Rachel," he said softly with a hint of helplessness and tenderness in his voice. "I do." Benjamin took Rachel to the marriage registry. He looked at her happy face, but his heart was mixed. He knew that this marriage was not based on real emotions, but he couldn't ignore the expectations in her eyes. "Have you really thought about it?" Benjamin asked softly again while filling out the form. Rachel nodded with a hint of determination in her eyes. "I'm sure, Ben. I want to be with you." Benjamin sighed. He knew that Rachel's decision was not entirely based on reason, but he couldn't refuse her cruelly. He looked at her happy face and his heart was full of contradictions and struggles. "Okay, Rachel," he said softly, handing the form to the staff. The staff took the form with a smile and began to process the procedures. Rachel held Benjamin's hand tightly, with a hint of expectation and happiness in her eyes. Although she had lost her memory, she instinctively felt that Benjamin was her only support. When the simple ring was put on Rachel's finger, Benjamin's heart was filled with complex emotions. He looked at her happy face and suddenly felt an indescribable sense of responsibility. He knew that this marriage was not based on real emotions, but he could not ignore the expectation in her eyes. "I will take care of you, Rachel," he said softly with a hint of tenderness in his eyes. Rachel nodded, leaned on his shoulder and closed her eyes. Although she had lost her memory, she instinctively felt that Benjamin was her only support. After marriage, Benjamin took Rachel to a small apartment under Rachel's name that looked ordinary. He didn't want Rachel to know his true identity, and just wanted to live an ordinary and happy life with her. Every morning, Benjamin would get up early and prepare breakfast. He looked at Rachel busy in the kitchen and his heart was filled with warmth. Although their lives were ordinary, they were full of fireworks. "Ben, we are going to the supermarket to buy discounted goods today," Rachel said excitedly, holding a supermarket flyer in her hand. Benjamin smiled and nodded. "Okay, let's go together." They went to the supermarket together. In order to save money, Rachel always carefully selected discounted goods. Although she had lost her memory, she was instinctively frugal, which surprised and warmed Benjamin. "You are always so frugal," Benjamin said softly with a hint of tenderness in his eyes. Rachel smiled. "This is my habit. Although I don't remember my previous life, I always feel that this is very down to earth." Benjamin nodded. He looked at her face full of happiness, and his heart was full of satisfaction. He knew that this marriage was not based on real emotions, but he could not ignore the expectations in her eyes. "Ben, what are we having tonight?" Rachel asked softly with a hint of expectation in her eyes. Benjamin thought for a moment and said, "Let's have pasta tonight. Do you like it?" Rachel nodded with a hint of happiness in her eyes. "I like it. I like anything I eat with you." Benjamin's heart warmed up. He looked at her happy face and suddenly felt an indescribable sense of responsibility. He knew that this marriage was not based on real emotions, but he could not ignore the expectation in her eyes. As time went by, Benjamin and Rachel's life gradually became plain and happy. They went to the supermarket together to buy discounted goods, racked their brains to save water and electricity bills, and gradually there was a sense of fireworks in their ordinary life. Benjamin looked at Rachel's happy face and felt satisfied. "Ben, I think this is great." Rachel sat on the sofa and looked at him with a hint of tenderness in her eyes. "Although I don't know what happened between us before, I am very happy now." Benjamin's heart warmed up. He walked to her side and hugged her gently. "Me too, Rachel. I am very happy." They snuggled together tightly. Although their lives were ordinary, they found their own happiness. The seeds of love quietly sprouted in their hearts. Although they didn't know what would happen in the future, they believed that as long as they were together, nothing could defeat them. However, Benjamin didn't know that a storm was quietly brewing. His family had discovered his disappearance and flash marriage, and Jessica was jealous when she learned that Benjamin was married, and vowed to make Rachel pay the price. Chapter 4. Seeds of Doubt. Time slipped away quietly like fine sand from fingers, and in a blink of an eye Benjamin and Rachel's married life had lasted for several weeks. Although life was still plain and warm, ripples gradually appeared under the calm surface. This morning the sun shone on Rachel's face through the gaps in the curtains. She rubbed her eyes and slowly sat up from the bed. Benjamin had gone out to deliver, and left her alone in the apartment. Rachel stretched and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. She opened the refrigerator and took out milk and bread. Her movements were so skillful that it seemed as if she had done it countless times. However, just as she was about to cut the bread, a vague picture suddenly flashed through her mind. It was a spacious and gorgeous kitchen, with exquisite tableware on the marble countertop, and she herself wearing an expensive dress standing there. The picture was fleeting, leaving her with only a brief confusion. Is this my memory? Rachel stopped her movements, frowned and tried to recall, but there was only chaos in her mind. She shook her head, trying to dispel these chaotic thoughts, and continued to prepare breakfast. As time went by, Rachel's memory occasionally flashed some fragments. These fragments appeared in her mind sporadically like broken puzzles, making her more and more confused. She began to doubt Benjamin's identity. She found that although Benjamin was dressed simply, his words and deeds, and his familiarity with some high-end things were not like an ordinary deliverman. One day, when Rachel was tidying up the living room, she accidentally found a business card of Benjamin. The business card was printed with the name of a well-known company and the title of Vice President. She held the business card, and an inexplicable uneasiness surged in her heart. "Ben, what is this?" Rachel walked into his room with a business card, with a tremor in her voice. Benjamin was sitting at the desk. When he saw the business card in Rachel's hand, his face changed slightly, and then he showed a gentle smile. "Oh, this is the business card of my previous company. I forgot to throw it away." Rachel looked at him with a trace of confusion in her eyes. "What did you do before?" Benjamin sighed and said softly, "I used to work in a company, but then I quit. Now I'm just a deliverman." Rachel nodded, but she couldn't completely let it go in her heart. She looked at Benjamin's deep eyes and suddenly felt that he seemed to be hiding something. "Ben, are you really just a deliverman?" Rachel asked softly, with a hint of expectation in her eyes. Benjamin was silent for a moment and finally nodded. "Yes, Rachel. I'm just a deliverman now." Rachel's heart was full of contradictions. She didn't know whether she should believe him, but she couldn't ignore the doubts in her heart. She looked at his familiar face and suddenly felt a little strange. A few days later, one evening, Benjamin received a call. A deep male voice came from the other end of the phone, speaking to him in a fluent foreign language. Rachel was preparing dinner in the kitchen. When she heard Benjamin talking in English, she paused slightly. "Ben, who are you talking to?" Rachel asked softly, with a hint of doubt in her eyes. Benjamin hung up the phone and smiled awkwardly. "Oh, this is an old friend of mine. He works abroad and occasionally contacts me." Rachel nodded, but she couldn't completely let it go in her heart. She looked at Benjamin's familiar face and suddenly felt a little strange. "Ben, are you really not hiding anything from me?" Rachel asked softly, with a hint of expectation in her eyes. Benjamin sighed and said softly, "Rachel, I'm not hiding anything from you. I just don't want you to worry." Rachel nodded, but she couldn't completely let it go in her heart. She looked at his familiar face and suddenly felt a little strange. At the same time, Benjamin's family also discovered his disappearance and flash marriage. The family sent a private detective to look for him everywhere and soon found Rachel. They felt that Rachel must be a scheming woman who wanted to get close to Benjamin and get the family's wealth. This woman must be a liar. The elder of the family looked at the information sent by the private detective, and a trace of anger appeared on his face. She approached Benjamin just for his wealth. "We must get her away from Benjamin," another elder said with a hint of unquestionable tone. "Benjamin is the heir of our family. He can't be fooled by such a woman." "I have sent someone to investigate," the family's housekeeper said. "We will find evidence to prove the true face of this woman." When Jessica learned that Benjamin was married, she was jealous. She always thought that she would become Benjamin's wife, but she didn't expect that he would marry a strange woman. She couldn't accept this fact and vowed to make Rachel pay the price. "I won't let her go." Jessica sat in her room looking at the photos of Benjamin and Rachel, with a hint of viciousness in her eyes. "I will make her regret coming into this world." She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Hello, it's me. I want you to help me check someone." "Yes, I want to know everything about her." A storm is brewing quietly, but Rachel and Benjamin are unaware of it. They are immersed in their own happiness, completely unaware that the danger is approaching step by step. As time goes by, Rachel's memory gradually recovers some fragments, but she feels more and more that Benjamin is hiding something. She began to alienate him and no longer rely on him as before. Benjamin saw it in his eyes and was anxious in his heart, but he didn't know how to explain it. "Rachel, what's wrong with you?" Benjamin asked softly, trying to hold her hand. Rachel stepped back subconsciously with a trace of confusion in her eyes. "Ben, I don't know. I always feel that you are hiding something from me." Benjamin's heart was shocked. He looked at her familiar yet unfamiliar face and suddenly felt powerless. He knew he couldn't hide it anymore, but he didn't know how to start. "Rachel, He was about to explain, but Rachel interrupted him. "You don't have to say it," Rachel said softly with a trace of disappointment in her eyes. "I just need time, Ben. I need time to figure it all out." Benjamin nodded, and he watched her turn and walk into the bedroom and close the door. His heart was full of pain and helplessness. He knew that he had lost her trust, but he didn't know how to save it. Chapter 5. Jessica's Conspiracy. Jessica was born in a famous family, spoiled since childhood and arrogant. After learning that Benjamin and Rachel were married, she used her family connections to launch a series of investigations on Rachel. After she found out about Rachel's amnesia, she had a vicious plan in mind. This woman has lost her memory? After listening to the private detective's report, Jessica showed a sly smile on her face. "That's great, I can use this to make her completely lose Benjamin." She picked up her phone and began to plan her conspiracy. First, she anonymously sent some edited videos to Rachel. In the video, Benjamin and her seemed to be close, and there were even a few vague conversations which made people mistakenly believe that there was an unusual relationship between them. The day Rachel received the video, she was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Her phone suddenly vibrated. She picked up the phone and saw a video link on the screen. Out of curiosity, she clicked on the link and the video quickly loaded. In the picture, Benjamin and Jessica walked side by side, talking and laughing, and even had several intimate physical contacts. Rachel's heart sank suddenly. She couldn't believe what she saw. She looked at Benjamin's smile in the video and tears couldn't help flowing down. "This is impossible," she whispered, her eyes full of pain and confusion. After the video ended, Rachel sat on the sofa and couldn't calm down for a long time. Her heart was full of doubts and uneasiness. She remembered that Benjamin said that he was just a deliveryman, but the scene in the video made her unable to believe his words. "Ben, what are you hiding?" she whispered with a tremor in her voice. At the same time, Jessica did not stop her conspiracy. She sent people to create chaos in places where Rachel often went. One day, Rachel went to the supermarket to buy things and just walked out of the supermarket door. She saw a strange man rushing towards her. She subconsciously dodged, but the man grabbed her arm and pushed her hard. "You bitch, stay away from Benjamin," the man said viciously and then turned away. Rachel fell to the ground, her knees scraped and blood oozed out. She raised her head and looked at the man's back, her heart full of fear and confusion. "Why did he do this?" she whispered, tears flowing again. After returning home, Rachel saw Benjamin sitting on the sofa waiting for her. When he saw the scars on her body, his face turned pale instantly. "Rachel, what's wrong with you?" He hurried over and supported her. Rachel raised her head and looked into his eyes, her heart full of contradictions. She didn't know whether she should believe him or tell him her suspicions. "Ben, are you really just a deliverman?" she asked softly with a hint of confusion in her eyes. Benjamin was stunned. He looked at her injured appearance and his heart was full of guilt and self-blame. He knew he couldn't hide it anymore, but he didn't know how to start. "Rachel, He was about to explain, but Rachel interrupted him. "You don't have to say it," she whispered with a hint of disappointment in her eyes. "I already know." Benjamin's heart was shocked, and he watched her turn and walk into the bedroom and close the door. He sat on the sofa, his heart full of pain and helplessness. He knew he had lost her trust, but he didn't know how to save it. At the same time, Jessica sat in her room, looking at the night view outside the window with a smug smile on her face. "Benjamin, you will come back to me soon," she whispered with a hint of viciousness in her eyes. Chapter 6. Conflict breaks out. The private detective handed the information about Rachel he had found to Benjamin's family. The family members found Benjamin and asked him to divorce Rachel immediately, and showed him some out-of-context information about Rachel, trying to make Benjamin believe that Rachel was someone with ulterior motives. This is the true face of that woman. The elder of the family threw a thick file in front of Benjamin. She approached you just for your wealth. You must divorce her immediately. Benjamin looked at the file, which was full of negative information about Rachel, and even malicious slander from some of her past business competitors. His heart was full of contradictions, but he couldn't completely believe the information. I don't believe it. He raised his head and looked at the elder of the family. I know Rachel is not such a person. You have been deceived by her. The elder of the family said coldly, we don't allow you to be with such a woman. You must divorce her immediately, otherwise the family will break off relations with you. Benjamin's heart was in chaos and he didn't know how to choose. He loved Rachel, but he couldn't go against the wishes of the family. At the same time, Rachel's memory recovered more and more, and she finally remembered her true identity and wealth. She felt that Benjamin had been deceiving her, and she had a fierce quarrel with Benjamin in anger. Who are you? Rachel stood in the middle of the living room and questioned Benjamin. Why did you lie to me? Benjamin raised his head and looked at her, his eyes full of pain. Rachel, I didn't mean it. I just don't want you to know my true identity. I'm afraid you will leave me. Leave you? Rachel sneered. Do you think I care about your identity? I just want to know if you have ever really loved me. Benjamin's heart was shocked. He lowered his head, not knowing what to say. He knew he had lost her trust, but he couldn't save it. Go. Rachel picked up the suitcase and put her clothes in one by one. I don't want to see you again. Benjamin watched her pack her luggage, his heart full of despair. He knew he had lost her, but he didn't know how to save her. Rachel, wait a minute. He walked forward and tried to grab her hand, but Rachel shook him off. Don't touch me. She yelled, tears streaming down her face. You make me sick. After that, she picked up her suitcase and left the apartment resolutely. Benjamin stood there, watching her leaving, his heart filled with pain and helplessness. He knew he had lost her, but he didn't know how to get her back. Chapter 7. The truth is coming to light. After leaving Benjamin, Rachel returned to her mansion. She sat on the sofa, feeling extremely heavy. She began to reflect on every bit of her time with Benjamin, and realized that her feelings for him were not due to false memories, but his kindness and sincerity. The mansion was silent, with only the occasional sound of the wind outside the window. Rachel hugged her knees, sat on the sofa and looked out the window with empty eyes. Her memory has gradually recovered, and those forgotten fragments have come like a tide, making her unable to calm down. Benjamin, she whispered in a low voice, with a hint of fatigue and confusion in her voice. She remembered that she was a rich woman, remembered everything she had, and remembered her loneliness and confusion. However, she could not forget the warmth and care Benjamin gave her. In those ordinary days, he filled the void in her heart with his kindness and sincerity. Do I really love him? Rachel whispered to herself, with a hint of confusion in her eyes. At the same time, Benjamin was also struggling in pain. He was determined to find out the reason for Rachel's change of attitude. By chance, he discovered Jessica's conspiracy. He found some edited videos and evidence of chaos in Jessica's room. It turned out to be you. Benjamin was furious. He found Jessica and accused her of her actions to her face. Jessica saw him and showed a smug smile on her face. Benjamin, you are finally back. I did this for you. For me. Benjamin sneered. Do you think I will thank you? Don't forget the relationship between our family and your family. Jessica said with a hint of viciousness in her eyes. If you don't divorce that woman, I will continue to hurt her. Benjamin's heart was shocked. He looked at Jessica's smug face and suddenly felt extremely disgusted. Do you think I will succumb to your threats? He roared. I will make you pay the price. Rachel sat on the sofa and recalled the days with Benjamin. She remembered that they went to the supermarket together to buy discounted goods, remembered his focused expression when he cooked for her, and remembered the tenderness in his eyes every time he saw her. These ordinary moments constitute the most precious memories in her heart. Does he really love me? Rachel asked herself in a low voice, with a hint of expectation in her eyes. She remembered that Benjamin once said that he would stay with her until she regained her memory. She knew that his words came from the heart and she could feel his sincerity. However, she could not ignore Jessica's conspiracy and the pressure from the family. What should I do? Rachel whispered in a low voice, tears welling up in her eyes. Chapter 8. Reconciliation and Counterattack. Benjamin knew that he could not let Jessica's conspiracy succeed, so he decided to confess everything to the family, including Jessica's bad behavior. After the family learned the truth, they were angry and disappointed with Jessica's behavior and cancelled the original marriage plan with her family. "Our family does not allow anyone to hurt our family," the elder of the family said with a hint of coldness in his eyes. "You must pay the price for your behavior." At the same time, Benjamin came to Rachel's mansion and confessed everything to her, including his identity, Jessica's conspiracy, and his love for her that has never changed. "Rachel, I love you." He stood in front of her with sincerity in his eyes. "I never thought of deceiving you. I'm just afraid that you will leave me." Rachel looked at him with a hint of confusion in her eyes. She didn't know whether she should believe him, but she couldn't forget the time they spent together. "Do you really love me?" she asked softly with a hint of expectation in her eyes. Benjamin nodded. "I love you, Rachel. I will prove it with my whole life." Rachel's heart warmed up. She looked at his familiar eyes and suddenly felt that all misunderstandings were no longer important. "I believe you," she said softly. Tears could not help but flow down. The two hugged each other tightly and all misunderstandings and resentments disappeared in an instant. "What should we do?" Benjamin asked softly. "We fight back." Rachel raised her head with a hint of determination in her eyes. "We will make that woman pay the price." So Rachel and Benjamin decided to fight back against Jessica together. They collected evidence of Jessica's evil deeds and revealed her true face. Benjamin found Rachel's lawyer friend and sorted out the anonymous videos, the confusing witness testimonies, and the transaction records of Jessica and the private detective into a complete chain of evidence. "These evidences are enough to ruin her reputation," the lawyer said with a hint of seriousness in his eyes. At a carefully planned press conference, Benjamin and Rachel publicly exposed Jessica's conspiracy. The media's camera was aimed at Jessica, and she tried to defend herself, but in the face of solid evidence her lies were self-defeating. "I just want to protect Benjamin," Jessica shouted hysterically at the press conference, but her voice was soon drowned out by the reporter's questioning. In the end, Jessica was punished by law for malicious slander and harming others, and her family broke off relations with her because of her behavior. She lost the support of her family and all the glory she once had. On a warm evening, the afterglow of the setting sun sprinkled into the room through the curtains, giving the entire space a soft golden color. Rachel sat on the sofa watching Benjamin's busy figure, her heart full of gratitude and warmth. She knew it was time to tell him everything. "Ben, there's something I've always wanted to tell you," Rachel said softly with a hint of hesitation in her voice. Benjamin stopped what he was doing, turned around and looked at her with concern. "What's wrong, Rachel?" Rachel took a deep breath with a firm look in her eyes. "Ben, I have a lot of real estate and a lot of wealth. I am a rich woman, but I have never told you." Benjamin was stunned. He looked at Rachel with a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Why, didn't you tell me earlier?" Rachel lowered her head with a hint of helplessness in her voice. "I'm afraid you will leave me because of my wealth. I just want to live an ordinary life with you. I don't want money to be a burden between us." Benjamin's heart was shocked. He walked to her side and gently held her hand. "Rachel, why do you think so? I love you not because of your wealth but because of your kindness and sincerity. I am willing to be with you whether poor or rich." Rachel raised her head and looked into his deep eyes, tears rolling in her eyes. "Ben, I love you too. I'm just afraid that you will be under pressure from the family because of me." Benjamin gently wiped away her tears and said softly, "We have been through so much, are we still afraid of this? No matter what happens, we will face it together." Although both of them have great wealth, they choose to continue to live an ordinary life. They moved back to the small apartment, cooking and cleaning the room together every day, enjoying ordinary and real happiness. Rachel no longer hides her identity, and Benjamin also accepts her wealth frankly. They know that these riches will not change their feelings for each other. "Ben, do you really not mind?" Rachel asked softly with a hint of uneasiness in her eyes. Benjamin smiled and gently held her hand. "Rachel, I love you not because of your wealth, but because you are Rachel. No matter how much wealth you have, it will not change my love for you." Rachel nodded, leaned on his shoulder and whispered, "Me too, Ben." I love you because you are Benjamin, not because of your identity. The two of them were close to each other, and their shadows were close to each other in the afterglow of the sunset. Despite countless storms, their love has become more firm. Days passed and the lives of the two were full of fireworks. They went to the supermarket to buy vegetables together, worked in the kitchen together, and shared the bits and pieces of life. Although Rachel had a lot of real estate under her name, she chose to live in that small apartment with Benjamin. She knew that true happiness is not brought by wealth, but by being with the one she loves. "Ben, let's go to the beach." One day Rachel suggested with a hint of expectation in her eyes. Benjamin nodded, smiled and said, "Okay, let's go to the beach." So they went to the beach together. On the beach they walked hand in hand, feeling the gentle breeze on their faces. Rachel leaned on Benjamin's shoulder and whispered, "Ben, I'm happy." Benjamin gently held her hand with a hint of tenderness in his eyes. "Me too, Rachel. I'm happy." The two smiled at each other, and in the afterglow of the sunset, their shadows were tightly attached to each other. Despite experiencing countless storms, their love has become more firm.